Ballerina is a spin-off from the John Wick universe where we follow Eve, played by Ana de Armas. She was raised under the teachings of the Ruska Roma, where she trains in becoming a contract killer and a ballerina. After catching a lead on the people who took her family away from her, she decides to go after them, using the resources of the Continental to leave a trail of blood behind her. So following the sentiment of the Wick franchise, this movie is too a revenge thriller. It's about a girl who was robbed of her childhood, using her skills to seek vengeance, putting herself at risk in the process. She's going after an organization that doesn't play by the same rules she and the rest of the underworld follow, making them riskier adversaries than what we're used to seeing in the world of Wick. There's a little bit of a recurring theme of the innocence and purity of childhood. It's the very thing that Eve was denied, but we also get glimpses of little ones throughout the movie in this crime-ridden world, quietly reminding us of the childhood Eve missed out on. The movie also seems like it wanted to be about breaking the code of the underworld. They planted a seed pretty early on about how she needs to adapt and cheat to survive. That seed did not grow on account of the fact that they just didn't seem to water it, like, at all. Before I dig into other shortcomings, let's first talk about the good. This being a movie in the Wick franchise, one of its biggest strengths is, of course, the action. It is jam-packed with slick action scenes and suspense. At first, I wasn't totally sold on the action. The Wick movies normally have exciting action scenes that often let takes run long before cutting, really flexing the choreography. There were a notable amount of action scenes in this movie where there were a lot of cuts and editing, which is, of course, to hide the imperfections of the choreography. Mostly in the first act though. And then there's the ones that have good long takes before cuts that really make you feel like you're there for the impossibly dope action scenes. And when they're good, they're really great. There were two scenes in particular that stood out where Eve cleverly uses whatever she can as weapons when guns are not available. Being a part of the Wick franchise, they obviously require suspension of disbelief. The feasibility of a few of these was questionable just because of how the weapons function. That's no different from the other Wick movies though. Assuming that you're not thinking about plausibility, the action is pretty awesome. I also liked the setup of this movie. We get to see a good bit of how the Ruska Roma operates and what it's like to go through the process of becoming one of their contract killers. Where in the previous Wick movies, the lore slowly unfolds over time, this movie fleshes things out in a more straightforward manner by making this criminal organization the movie's home base. So as a spin-off, does this movie expand the world of Wick, or is it just another fun ride for fans of the franchise? It kind of expands it. The antagonists belong to a criminal organization that I don't believe we've seen yet, and they show us that not everyone in the Wick underworld shares the same values or code of conduct, but there definitely could have been more done to flesh out those expanded details. The workings of that organization are pretty vague. Instead of digging into the nitty-gritty of their beliefs and motivations, the movie just tends to sensationalize their cult-like behavior as if that alone is enough. The antagonists, the premise, and some of the plot revelations, when you think about it, are actually pretty cliche. They're just made more interesting by simply being in the Wick underworld. Some of the plot veers into soap opera territory with its pretty generic family-related struggles and not very scrumptious of a revenge plot. It's definitely not one where you're sitting there thinking, oh man, I hope she makes them beg. And some of the details and revelations prove to be pretty irrelevant by the end of the movie, specifically with Eve's family. There is, of course, potential for payoff in a sequel, but for a single film and a single story, it just feels like it's full of afterthoughts to make it seem more intricate than it actually is. There were also plenty of little things throughout the movie that bugged me. I say little because they're not big oversights as much as they're just indicative of lacking attention to detail. I can suspend my disbelief in action plausibility because these movies train me to do this. However, it's a bit harder when the movies contradict themselves. For example, there was a scene early on in this movie where even though nobody was getting killed, I was sitting there thinking, man, these people in the background of this club are really unfazed by the fact that a gun is going off. And then a few scenes later, somebody deliberately stirs up a crowd by firing off shots, and I'm sitting there thinking, wait, you just trained me to think that that was normal 2 seconds ago. Same with the bulletproof lining in the suits that are only reserved for John Wick for some reason, where previously you could see that getting shot still hurts. In this movie, the bullet deflection looks about as stoic as Wonder Woman. And then there's John Wick himself, who is in this movie, and I just can't shake the feeling that his place in it felt forced. It feels like a studio note because Lionsgate was just worried that people would be less interested in a Wick franchise movie that didn't have Wick. I get it, he's the guy who we followed for 4 films making this franchise what it is, but his inclusion in this story does not feel organic. It's not like Rogue One where it dives into the details of how something big and important to the franchise happened. It's just like, yeah, so John Wick did this thing in between chapters 3 and 4. Like, there wasn't a gap there that this movie fills by including him. Eve's story is adjacent to his and just so happens to include him. His inclusion might also be just to make up for the fact that our protagonist here, unfortunately, just isn't that interesting. Eve has character depth and reasons to fight, but she's otherwise kind of just a vanilla action movie protagonist. That's not to say that John Wick himself was that interesting in the first movie. He was also kind of vanilla, but what made that movie interesting was figuring out the lore of this world that was cryptic but very intricate at the time. With that experience already under our belt, for them to give us another movie in the Wick world, they need to give us more interesting characters and not more flat action characters with hardcore plot armor. Eve was less interesting than Rami Malek's character in The Amateur. So if you approach this movie with any amount of scrutiny, the imperfections are hard not to notice, but again, the small dive into the workings of the Ruska Roma and the slick action scenes, they're both there. And that action is what the bulk of the movie is made of, which is to be expected for a Wick movie. This franchise focuses on dope action first and then plot second, so we can't be too surprised. So were the pros enough to outweigh the cons of this movie? To me, they were enough to say that the movie was decent. If you know what you're getting into with a Wick movie, then it can be a cool little excursion. Thank you for watching this review. If it brought you any value at all, please give it a like. It really helps this channel grow. I'll see you later this week with my review of The Life of Chuck.